The spring of 1336 brought no portents of world-shaking change to the modest village of Kesh, near Samarkand, where a boy was born into the barless tribe of the Chagatai Khanate. The child who would become Tamerlane entered a world already drowning in the ruins of Mongol greatness, a landscape of fractured khanates and fading glory, where the descendants of Genghis Khan's all-conquering armies had degenerated into petty warlords squabbling over the bones of an empire. Nothing in the circumstances of his birth suggested that this infant would resurrect the terror and majesty of the Mongol conquests, that his name would be whispered with the same dread that had once accompanied mention of the great Khan himself. The young Timur grew into a warrior in an age when warfare was the only reliable path to advancement for ambitious men of the steppes. The education he received was not found in books or palaces, but in the hard school of survival on the Central Asian frontier, where tribal politics demanded constant vigilance and where weakness invited swift destruction. His people, the Barlas, were themselves descendants of Mongol warriors who had settled in Transoxiana following the original conquests, yet they had adopted much of the Persian culture that dominated the region, creating a hybrid identity that would profoundly shape Timur's later rule. He learned to speak both Chagatai Turkish and Persian, to appreciate the sophisticated urban culture of Samarkand, while retaining the martial values of the nomadic tradition. The injury that would give him his most famous epithet occurred during a raid in his youth, when an arrow or sword stroke left him permanently lame in his right leg and damaged his right arm. The chronicles differ on the precise circumstances, some claiming it happened during a sheep raid, others during a more serious military encounter. But the result was undeniable. The man who would terrorize 3 continents bore throughout his life the physical marks of early failure, walking with a distinctive limp that earned him the Persian nickname Timur-i-Lang, Timur the Lame, which Western tongues would corrupt into Tamerlane. Yet this disability, which might have destroyed the prospects of a lesser man, seemed only to intensify his determination to prove his worth through military achievement. The Chagatai Khanate into which Timur matured was a perfect incubator for ambitious warriors. The death of the last effective Khan in 1334 had left the realm divided between competing tribal leaders, each claiming authority while possessing insufficient power to enforce it. The cities of Transoxiana, those jewels of the Silk Road trade routes, changed hands repeatedly as various factions fought for control of the wealth that flowed through Samarkand, Bokhara, and Balkh. Into this chaos Timur inserted himself with a cunning that suggested gifts far beyond mere military prowess, forming alliances, betraying them when advantageous, and steadily accumulating the power and followers that would become the foundation of his conquests. The path Timur followed to absolute power revealed a political sophistication that matched his military capabilities. He understood instinctively what many conquerors learn too late or never grasp at all: that in the nomadic tradition of the steppes, legitimacy flowed from descent, and no amount of military success could substitute for the proper bloodline. Timur himself, though noble by the standards of the Barlas tribe, could claim no direct descent from Genghis Khan, whose lineage had been carefully preserved through the Borjigin clan. This fundamental deficit in legitimacy would haunt his entire career, forcing him to adopt increasingly elaborate strategies to justify his authority. The solution he devised demonstrated both his creativity and his understanding of political symbolism. In 1370, having finally maneuvered himself into supreme power in Transoxiana through a combination of military victory and political assassination, Timur declined to take the title of Khan, which by Mongol tradition belonged only to descendants of Genghis Khan. Instead, he married into the Chagatai royal family, taking as his wife Saray Mulk Khanum, a direct descendant of the great Khan, and styled himself Gurkhan, the royal son-in-law. Throughout his reign, he maintained puppet Khans of proper Genghisid descent on the throne while wielding absolute power himself, a legal fiction that satisfied the conservative instincts of the nomadic aristocracy while allowing Timur to exercise imperial authority. The regime that Timur constructed in the 1370s represented a calculated synthesis of nomadic military tradition with Persian administrative sophistication. His army remained fundamentally a steppe force, organized around the traditional two-month system of decimal military units, with cavalry providing the core striking power that had made the original Mongol conquests possible. Yet Timur supplemented this traditional structure with siege engineers recruited from the conquered territories, with infantry drawn from the settled populations of Transoxiana, and with the latest developments in military technology, including early cannon and other gunpowder weapons. The result was a military machine that combined the mobility and shock power of nomadic cavalry with the staying power needed for prolonged siege operations. The early campaigns that Timur launched from his Samarkand base established the pattern that would characterize his entire career: swift movement, overwhelming concentration of force at decisive points, and the systematic use of terror to discourage resistance. Between 1370 and 1380, he consolidated control over Transoxiana, crushed a rebellion by his former ally Husain, and began the systematic subjugation of Khwarezm and the territories beyond the Oxus River. These victories, impressive enough in their own right, were merely preparatory exercises for the greater conquests that would follow, testing grounds where Timur perfected the military and administrative techniques that would carry his armies from the Volga to the Ganges. The military system that Timur developed represented both continuity with Mongol tradition and significant innovation adapted to 14th century conditions. Like the armies of Genghis Khan, Timur's forces emphasized mobility, reconnaissance, and the coordination of multiple converging columns across vast distances. The detailed intelligence gathering that preceded major campaigns allowed Timur to exploit enemy weaknesses with precision, while his mastery of logistics enabled him to sustain operations far from his Central Asian base for months or even years at a time. Yet he also recognized that the military environment of the 14th century differed significantly from that of the 13th, requiring adaptations that his more conservative nomadic contemporaries often failed to make. The siege warfare that characterized much of Timur's campaigning demanded capabilities that pure nomadic armies had traditionally lacked. The great cities of the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Damascus to Delhi, were protected by sophisticated fortifications that could not be taken by cavalry charges alone. Timur addressed this challenge by systematically recruiting engineers, artisans, and technical specialists from conquered territories, creating a siege train that could deploy trebuchets, siege towers, mining operations, and eventually gunpowder weapons with devastating effectiveness. The speed with which his forces could reduce fortified positions that had withstood earlier besiegers for months or years testified to the technical sophistication that complemented raw military power. Yet Timur's most effective weapon was psychological rather than material. The calculated use of terror as an instrument of policy represented a deliberate choice, not the random cruelty of an unstable mind. When cities resisted his initial summons to surrender, Timur ensured that their fate would serve as an example to others who might contemplate defiance. The pyramids of skulls that marked the sites of destroyed cities, the reports of populations massacred in their entirety, the stories of creative tortures inflicted upon captured defenders, all serve the strategic purpose of convincing subsequent targets that surrender offered the only rational choice. The paradox of Timur's terror was its effectiveness. The more horrifying his reputation became, the more cities opened their gates without resistance, ultimately reducing the overall level of bloodshed required to achieve his objectives. The organization of conquered territories revealed Timur's understanding that military conquest represented only the beginning of imperial construction. Unlike some conquerors who exhausted themselves through constant warfare while neglecting the administrative foundations of lasting power, Timur devoted considerable attention to establishing governance structures capable of extracting resources while maintaining order. The system he created combined elements of traditional Mongol administration with Persian bureaucratic practices, appointing governors drawn from his most trusted followers while employing local officials who understood the intricacies of tax collection and civil administration. The tribute that flowed from conquered territories financed further expansion while enriching the capital at Samarkand, creating a self-sustaining cycle of conquest and consolidation. The decision to launch a major campaign into Persia in 1380 represented a calculated assessment of opportunity and strategic necessity. The Ilkhanate that had ruled Persia and Iraq since the original Mongol conquests had collapsed into warring factions following the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335. Leaving the wealthy cities and agricultural territories of the Iranian plateau vulnerable to whoever could impose order through force. For Timur, Persia represented both a strategic threat, as various Iranian dynasties might potentially unite to challenge his authority in Transoxiana, and an irresistible opportunity, as the conquest of such wealthy territories would provide the resources necessary for even greater achievements. The campaigns that unfolded across Persia between 1380 and 1387 demonstrated the full range of Timur's military capabilities. The initial invasion swept through eastern Persia with bewildering speed, overcoming local resistance before defenders could coordinate effective opposition. Herat, that ancient center of Persian culture, fell after a siege that showcased Timur's siege capabilities while providing a grim preview of the fate awaiting cities that resisted. The city's scholars, artisans, and craftsmen were deported to Samarkand to enhance the capital's cultural prestige, while much of the remaining population was massacred as punishment for their resistance, their skulls arranged in pyramids that would stand for generations as warnings to others. The systematic reduction of Persian resistance required multiple campaigns, as various local powers attempted to exploit Timur's temporary absences to reassert independence. Each rebellion was met with ferocious reprisals that escalated the scale of destruction beyond even the horrific precedents set by earlier campaigns. When Isfahan revolted in 1387 after having initially submitted, Timur's response was calculated to ensure that no other city would make the same mistake. His forces methodically slaughtered the population, with contemporary chronicles claiming that 70,000 heads were collected to construct towers of skulls at the city's gates. Whether the actual number reached such heights or represented exaggeration by terrified observers mattered less than the psychological impact, which achieved exactly what Timur intended: the complete elimination of further resistance throughout Persia. The consequences of the Persian campaigns extended far beyond their immediate military and political results. The systematic deportation of skilled workers, scholars, and artists from conquered Persian cities to Samarkand initiated a cultural transfer that would transform Timur's capital into one of the great centers of Islamic civilization. The architects who had built the magnificent mosques of Herat and Isfahan now devoted their talents to creating even more spectacular monuments in Samarkand, while poets, calligraphers, and scholars found reluctant patronage at a court that valued their skills even as it had destroyed their homes. This forced cultural migration created the foundation for what historians would later call the Timurid Renaissance, demonstrating that even amid the most brutal military campaigns, Timur maintained a clear vision of the civilization he hoped to create. The eruption of conflict between Timur and Toktamish, Khan of the Golden Horde, represented more than a mere territorial dispute between rival powers. Here was a confrontation between two claimants to the Mongol legacy, each presenting himself as the rightful heir to Genghis Khan's conquests, each determined to prove his superiority through the traditional Mongol method of decisive warfare. Toktamish, unlike Timur, could claim direct descent from Genghis Khan through Joki, the eldest son, and his control of the vast territories of the Golden Horde gave him resources that rivaled those of Timur's empire. The clash between these two powers would determine which interpretation of the Mongol inheritance would prevail in the 14th century. The initial phases of the conflict saw Toktamish attempting to exploit Timur's involvement in Persia by launching raids into Transoxiana, and even briefly occupying Samarkand's suburbs in 1388. This violation of Timur's heartland represented a challenge that could not be ignored without fatally undermining his authority among his own followers. The response, when it came, demonstrated the speed and decisiveness that characterized Timur's military decision-making. Abandoning his Persian campaigns, he led his armies northward in a pursuit of Toktamish that would range across thousands of miles of steppe territory, through the Caucasus Mountains, and ultimately deep into the Russian territories controlled by the Golden Horde. The Battle of the Kundurcha River in 1391 marked the climax of the first major confrontation between these rival powers. Timur's victory, achieved after a brutal struggle that cost thousands of lives on both sides, temporarily broke the military power of the Golden Horde while demonstrating that Timur's forces could defeat even legitimate Jenghisid armies in open battle. Yet the nature of steppe warfare, with its emphasis on mobility and the difficulty of achieving permanent conquest of nomadic populations, meant that Toktamish survived to rebuild his forces and renew the conflict. The cycle of invasion and counter-invasion would continue through the 1390s, draining resources and attention that might otherwise have been devoted to conquests elsewhere. The final campaign against Toktamish in 1395 achieved a more complete victory, with Timur's armies pursuing the defeated Khan deep into Russian territories and systematically destroying the commercial cities of the Golden Horde, including the great trading center of Astrakhan. The devastation of these crucial nodes in the East-West trade network had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military conflict, contributing to the economic disruption that would eventually redirect trade routes and reshape the political geography of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The victory over the Golden Horde established Timur as the unquestioned dominant power throughout the Eastern Islamic world. Yet it also revealed the limitations of his power. He could destroy rival nomadic states, but could not permanently occupy their territories or prevent their eventual reconstitution under new leadership. While armies marched and cities burned throughout 3 continents, the capital at Samarkand underwent a transformation that revealed the creative dimension of Timur's imperial vision. The wealth extracted from conquered territories through systematic taxation and outright plunder flowed toward this ancient Silk Road city, financing a construction program that would make Samarkand one of the architectural marvels of the medieval world. The forced migration of craftsmen, artists, and scholars from every corner of Timur's expanding empire created in Samarkand a concentration of talent and expertise that had not been seen since the golden age of Abbasid Baghdad. The building projects that defined Timur's capital reflected his ambition to create a physical manifestation of imperial grandeur that would outlast his own lifetime. The Bibi Khana Mosque, commissioned to be the largest mosque in the Islamic world, employed architectural techniques and decorative programs drawn from across the conquered territories. Its massive dome and soaring portals designed to inspire awe in all who beheld them. The Registan, the great public square at the heart of Samarkand, became a showcase for the architectural synthesis that characterized Timurid art, blending Persian decorative traditions with Central Asian structural forms and creating an aesthetic that would influence Islamic architecture for centuries. Yet the cultural flowering of Samarkand existed in profound tension with the brutality that made it possible. The same hands that constructed towers of skulls outside Isfahan arranged the intricate tilework that adorned Samarkand's mosques and palaces. The wealth that financed architectural marvels came from populations whose cities had been systematically plundered, whose populations had been massacred or enslaved, whose civilizations had been disrupted or destroyed to feed Timur's imperial ambitions. This paradox at the heart of Timur's legacy forces uncomfortable questions about the relationship between cultural achievement and political violence, between the production of beauty and the exercise of terror. The court that assembled in Samarkand brought together an extraordinary collection of intellectual and artistic talent, much of it present under compulsion rather than choice. The great historian Ibn Khaldun, captured during Timur's Syrian campaign, engaged the conqueror in philosophical discussions about the nature of power and civilization, conversations that revealed Timur's genuine intellectual curiosity alongside his ruthless pragmatism. Poets and scholars from across the Islamic world found themselves reluctant guests at a court that valued their expertise while remaining fundamentally shaped by the martial values of the steppes. The cultural synthesis that emerged from these forced encounters would prove more enduring than many of Timur's political achievements, influencing Persian literature, Islamic art, and Central Asian culture for generations after his empire had fragmented. The transformation of Samarkand from a provincial city of the shattered Chagatai Khanate into a glittering imperial capital revealed Timur's vision of his own legacy. He understood that military conquest alone, however spectacular, would be forgotten unless anchored in more permanent achievements. The monuments he commanded, the artists he patronized, and the scholars he assembled represented an attempt to ensure that his name would be remembered not merely as another nomadic conqueror, but as a builder of civilization comparable to the greatest rulers of the Islamic tradition. Yet even as Samarkand rose to unprecedented magnificence, Timur's armies prepared for campaigns that would dwarf all previous achievements in their scope and consequence. The conquest of Persia and the defeat of the Golden Horde had established him as the dominant power in Central Asia and the Eastern Islamic world. But to truly claim the mantle of Genghis Khan's heir, to prove himself the master of the age, Timur would need to defeat the greatest powers of his time in their own territories, to carry his standards to regions that had never acknowledged nomadic authority. The campaigns that would follow would test whether the military machine he had perfected over decades of constant warfare could overcome adversaries fundamentally different from those he had previously faced. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria, the Ottoman Empire that was rising to dominance in Anatolia, and the Delhi Sultanate that controlled the riches of India, all represented challenges of a different order than the fractured Persian principalities or nomadic khanates he had previously conquered. These were established, powerful states with professional armies, sophisticated fortifications, and administrative systems capable of mobilizing vast resources for their defense. The confrontation with these powers would determine whether Timur's empire represented merely another episode in the endless cycle of steppe conquests and dissolutions, or whether he had forged something more lasting and significant. The answers would be written in blood across battlefields from Ankara to Delhi, in the ruins of great cities, and ultimately in the legacy that would shape the Islamic world for centuries after his death. The decision to invade India in 1398 represented both strategic calculation and the irresistible attraction of a target whose wealth had tempted conquerors since antiquity. The Delhi Sultanate, though weakened by internal divisions and the recent death of Sultan Firuz Shah Tughlaq, remained one of the richest and most populous states in the medieval world. The treasures accumulated by generations of Muslim rulers in India, the agricultural wealth of the Gangetic Plain, and the prestige that would accompany victory over such a formidable opponent all drew Timur toward the Indian subcontinent like iron to a lodestone. The invasion route that Timur selected revealed his strategic sophistication and his willingness to embrace extreme hardship in pursuit of his objectives. Rather than following the traditional invasion corridor through the Khyber Pass, which would have alerted defenders and allowed them time to organize resistance, Timur led his armies through the high mountain passes of the Hindu Kush in the depths of winter, enduring conditions that killed thousands of soldiers and animals, but achieving complete strategic surprise. The appearance of Timurid armies descending from passes that the Sultanate's defenders had considered impassable in winter created panic throughout northern India. The systematic devastation that accompanied Timur's advance toward Delhi exceeded even his previous campaigns in its calculated cruelty. Cities that resisted were methodically destroyed, their populations massacred, their treasures looted with a thoroughness that suggested not merely military necessity, but a deliberate policy of terror. The Hindu population, viewed by Timur's followers as legitimate targets for enslavement and slaughter due to their religious status, suffered particularly horrific treatment, with contemporary sources describing massacres that numbered in the tens of thousands. The theological justifications offered for these atrocities revealed how easily religious ideology could be deployed to sanctify actions motivated primarily by greed and military advantage. The Battle of Delhi on December 17, 1398, demonstrated that Timur's military superiority extended even to the sophisticated armies of the Sultanate. Sultan Mahmud Shah Tughlaq had assembled a force that contemporary sources numbered at over 100,000 men, including war elephants that had traditionally proved decisive in Indian warfare. Yet Timur's tactical innovations, including the use of flaming materials and caltrops to terrify and disable the elephants, combined with the superior discipline and coordination of his cavalry, produced a crushing victory that left the Sultanate's army shattered and its capital defenseless. The occupation and systematic plunder of Delhi that followed represented one of the most catastrophic episodes in the city's long history. 4 days, Timur's soldiers moved through the city methodically, stripping it of wealth, enslaving artisans and craftsmen, and slaughtering those considered too old or weak to be valuable. When a minor incident sparked broader violence, Timur either authorized or simply allowed a general massacre that may have claimed 100,000 lives, leaving the great city that had been the jewel of Muslim India a smoking ruin inhabited primarily by corpses. The wealth extracted from Delhi and transported back to Samarkand exceeded that of any previous campaign, enriching Timur's treasury while demonstrating to the Islamic world the consequences of challenging his authority. The decision to turn westward after returning from India represented Timur's most ambitious strategic gambit, an attempt to confront and defeat the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria, the most powerful military state in the Islamic world. The Mamluks, who had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 and had systematically eliminated the last Crusader states in the Levant, represented the most formidable opponents Timur had yet faced. Their professional slave soldier system produced warriors whose training and equipment matched anything Timur's forces could deploy, while their control of the economic resources of Egypt and the Levantine trade routes gave them financial capabilities that rivaled those of Timur's empire. The invasion of Syria in 1400 proceeded with a methodical efficiency that characterized Timur's mature military operations. The great cities of the Levant fell in succession to his advancing armies. Aleppo, after a brief siege that ended with the customary massacre and the construction of skull pyramids. Damascus, after a longer resistance that resulted in even more extensive devastation. The destruction of these ancient centers of Islamic civilization sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world, revealing that even the heartlands of the faith were vulnerable to Timur's armies and raising disturbing questions about whether any power could effectively resist him. The encounter between Timur and Ibn Khaldun, the great historian and philosopher who was serving as a judge in Damascus, provided a remarkable glimpse into the intellectual dimension of Timur's character. Their conversations, recorded by Ibn Khaldun and preserved through the centuries, revealed a conqueror genuinely interested in philosophical questions about the nature of power, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the relationship between nomadic and settled societies. Yet this intellectual curiosity existed alongside, and apparently without contradiction to the brutal pragmatism that led Timur to order the systematic destruction of Damascus despite Ibn Khaldun's pleas for mercy. The philosophical discussions continued even as the city burned, and its population was slaughtered or enslaved. The Mamluk response to Timur's Syrian campaign demonstrated both the military capabilities and the strategic limitations of the Sultanate. Sultan Faraj, young and inexperienced, assembled a relief force but proved unable to coordinate effective resistance against Timur's superior tactics and mobility. The defeat of Mamluk forces outside Damascus and the subsequent withdrawal of the Sultan to Egypt left Syria at Timur's mercy, yet it also revealed the practical limits of his conquests. Egypt itself, protected by desert distances and possessed of military resources that might prove decisive in prolonged conflict, remained beyond his reach. Timur could devastate Syria and humble the Mamluks, but he could not eliminate them as a major power. The collision between Timur's empire and the rising Ottoman state represented a confrontation between two very different models of Islamic power and territorial organization. The Ottomans under Sultan Bayezid I, called Yildirim or the Thunderbolt for his swift military campaigns, had built a formidable empire that straddled Europe and Asia, conquering Byzantine territories in the Balkans while systematically absorbing the Turkish Emirates of Anatolia. Bayezid's recent victory at Nicopolis in 1396, where he had crushed a major crusading expedition, had established him as one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world and a potential rival to Timur's claims of universal authority. The tensions between these two powers reflected fundamentally different approaches to empire building and Islamic governance. The Ottoman system, already evolving toward the sophisticated administrative apparatus that would characterize its mature form, emphasized the permanent conquest and integration of territories through the Devshirme system of military slavery and the Timur system of land grants. Timur's empire, by contrast, remained fundamentally nomadic in character despite its sophisticated bureaucracy, more concerned with extracting tribute and maintaining military supremacy than with the systematic administration of conquered territories. The clash between these competing visions of Islamic empire was perhaps inevitable. The diplomatic exchanges that preceded military conflict revealed the personal dimensions of the confrontation between these two formidable rulers. Bayezid's refusal to recognize Timur's authority or to return refugees who had fled from Timurid territories provided the immediate casus belli. Yet deeper issues of prestige and dominance shaped the drift toward war. Both rulers understood that their conflict would determine which model of Islamic power would prevail, which approach to empire building would prove superior in the crucible of battle. The propaganda that accompanied their military preparations emphasized not merely territorial disputes, but fundamental questions about legitimacy, religious authority, and the proper organization of Islamic political power. The armies that converged near Ankara in the summer of 1402 represented the culmination of decades of military development and the concentration of military power on a scale rarely seen in medieval warfare. Bayezid had assembled perhaps 120,000 men, including the finest Janissary infantry yet produced by the Ottoman system, Serbian heavy cavalry from his Balkan conquests, and Turkish cavalry drawn from throughout Anatolia. Against this formidable force, Timur deployed an even larger army, perhaps 140,000 strong, drawn from the entire breadth of his empire and including the battle-hardened veterans of campaigns from India to Syria. The battle that unfolded on July 20th, 1402, demonstrated that military genius could overcome even significant disadvantages in position and initial deployment. Bayezid had chosen his ground carefully, occupying a strong defensive position with access to water supplies, while Timur's forces suffered from the summer heat and limited access to reliable water sources. Yet Timur's tactical innovations and his use of psychological warfare proved decisive. By secretly securing alternative water sources and by deploying agents who spread rumors and bribed Ottoman vassal contingents to defect, he undermined Ottoman morale before the main battle was even joined. The desertion of the Turkish Anatolian contingents at the critical moment of battle transformed what might have been a hard-fought victory into a catastrophic Ottoman defeat. As these forces switched sides or simply fled the battlefield, the Ottoman flanks collapsed, leaving Bayezid's core forces surrounded by vastly superior numbers. The Sultan himself, fighting with desperate courage to the last, was captured along with his son after a final stand that demonstrated the personal bravery that had earned him his Thunderbolt sobriquet. The cream of Ottoman military power lay dead on the field, the Janissaries virtually annihilated in a last stand that rivaled any in military history for sheer determination against overwhelming odds. The treatment of the captured Sultan revealed Timur's complex character, his capacity for both respect and cruelty. Initial reports that Bayezid was confined in a cage appear to have been exaggerated or fabricated by hostile sources. Yet there was no question that the Ottoman Sultan was subjected to calculated humiliations designed to emphasize his defeat and subordination. When Bayezid died in captivity 8 months later, whether through illness, suicide, or more active means remains disputed by historians, Timur had achieved perhaps the most spectacular single victory of his entire career. The Ottoman state, which had seemed poised to become the dominant power in the Islamic world, lay shattered, its territories divided among Bayezid's sons in a civil war that would paralyze Ottoman expansion for a generation. The years following the triumph at Ankara might have seemed to mark the apex of Timur's power, yet they also revealed the fundamental limitations of the nomadic imperial model he had perfected. The territories he controlled stretched across 3 continents, from the borders of China to the Mediterranean, from the steppes of Russia to the Indian Ocean. Yet the very vastness of this empire created administrative and military challenges that even Timur's considerable abilities could not entirely overcome. The constant campaigning required to maintain control over such diverse territories exhausted even the most hardened warriors, while the logistics of coordinating military operations across such vast distances pushed the limits of medieval communication and transportation systems. The attempt to establish a permanent administrative structure capable of governing this enormous empire revealed the tensions between nomadic tradition and the requirements of settled governance. Timur appointed governors drawn from his most trusted followers to control major provinces. Yet these appointees often proved more interested in establishing their own power bases than in serving the central authority. The fiscal system that extracted tribute from conquered territories operated efficiently enough when Timur's armies were present to enforce compliance. But provincial governors quickly learned to withhold revenues when central authority was distant or preoccupied with other concerns. The result was a perpetual cycle of rebellion, reconquest, and renewed submission that consumed resources and attention that might otherwise have been devoted to further expansion. The cultural achievements that made Samarkand a center of Islamic civilization existed in profound tension with the military imperatives that had created the empire. The forced migration of scholars, artists, and craftsmen that enriched the capital also created reservoirs of resentment and resistance in the conquered territories from which they had been extracted. The architectural marvels and cultural flowering that Timur patronized represented genuine achievements, yet they were built on foundations of mass violence and systematic exploitation that corrupted their aesthetic and intellectual magnificence. The paradox at the heart of Timur's legacy remained unresolved. Could greatness achieved through such means be considered truly great? Or did the methods employed fundamentally taint the achievements they made possible? The decision to launch a campaign against Ming China in 1404 represented the final and most ambitious project of Timur's career, an attempt to complete the restoration of Mongol glory by conquering the one great power that had successfully expelled Mongol rule and re-established native Chinese authority. The Ming dynasty, established by the Mongol Emperor in 1368 after the expulsion of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, represented both a personal affront to Timur's claims of Mongol legitimacy and a strategic challenge that could not be ignored if his empire was to achieve lasting stability. The conquest of China would provide resources that dwarfed even those of India or Persia, while completing the restoration of the Mongol Empire that Timur had proclaimed as his life's mission. The preparations for the Chinese campaign revealed Timur's understanding that this would be the most challenging military operation of his career. The armies that assembled in Samarkand in late 1404 represented the culmination of decades of military development, including not only the traditional cavalry forces that had always formed the core of Timurid military power, but also substantial infantry contingents, sophisticated siege trains, and logistical capabilities designed to sustain operations across the vast distances of Central Asia and into China proper. The scale of the preparations, which included the stockpiling of supplies along the invasion routes and the coordination of multiple supporting campaigns, demonstrated that Timur intended to stake everything on this final gamble. Yet the Chinese campaign also revealed that even Timur's formidable constitution had limits. The conqueror who had endured the hardships of countless campaigns, who had survived wounds that would have killed lesser men, who had imposed his will through sheer force of personality on the greatest warriors of his age, was now approaching 70 years old. The physical toll of decades of constant warfare, the accumulated injuries and illnesses, the sheer exhaustion of a lifetime spent in the saddle and on the battlefield, all conspired to undermine the iron will that had sustained his remarkable career. The winter of 1404 to 1405 was unusually harsh even by the standards of Central Asia, and the aged conqueror who led his armies eastward from Samarkand toward the Chinese frontier found himself increasingly unable to endure the conditions that he had once dismissed with contempt. The exact nature of Timur's final illness remains disputed by historians, with contemporary sources offering various explanations ranging from fever to the simple accumulated debilitations of age. What remains undisputed is that by early February 1405, as his armies bivouacked near Otrar in present-day Kazakhstan, Timur recognized that he would not live to see China or to complete the grand design that had consumed his final years. The death of Tamerlane on February 18, 1405, unleashed precisely the succession crisis that his iron grip on power had postponed but never prevented. His carefully constructed empire, held together through personal loyalty to a leader whose military genius and ruthless determination had proven impossible to resist, began fragmenting almost immediately as his sons and grandsons competed for control of his inheritance. The divisions that he had papered over through force and prestige immediately reopened, revealing that the institutional foundations necessary for lasting empire had never been fully established beneath the edifice of personal power. The body of the conqueror was returned to Samarkand and interred in the Guri Emir Mausoleum, a monument whose architectural magnificence testified to the cultural achievements of his reign even as his empire crumbled around it. The tomb became a pilgrimage site for those who remembered or imagined the glory of Timur's conquests. Yet it also served as a reminder of the ultimate futility of personal ambition divorced from institutional permanence. The man who had terrorized 3 continents, who had destroyed cities and kingdoms, who had built monuments that still inspire awe 6 centuries later, lay beneath a simple slab of dark green jade, his conquests already dissolving into the chaos from which they had emerged. The succession struggle that erupted immediately upon Timur's death revealed the fundamental weakness of an empire built around the military genius and personal authority of a single individual. His designated successor, his grandson Pir Muhammad, lacked both the military capabilities and the political cunning necessary to maintain control over the diverse territories and ambitious commanders that constituted the Timurid Empire. Within months, rival claimants had emerged throughout the empire, each commanding loyal military forces and each claiming legitimacy through descent from Timur or through control of crucial territories. The civil war that consumed the Timurid Empire between 1405 and 1409 demonstrated how completely the empire's unity had depended upon Timur's personal leadership. Shah Rukh, Timur's youngest son, who had been governing Khorasan during his father's final campaign, emerged as the most capable of the contenders. Yet even his eventual consolidation of power over most of the empire required years of warfare and resulted in the permanent loss of several major territories. The western conquests in Anatolia, Syria, and Iraq were quickly lost as local powers reasserted independence or as rival claimants established their own domains. The northern territories beyond the Oxus fell away as competing Mongol and Turkic dynasties filled the power vacuum left by Timurid withdrawal. Yet the fragmentation of Timur's political empire did not mean the complete disappearance of his legacy. Shah Rukh, ruling from Herat rather than Samarkand, initiated what historians would later recognize as the Timurid Renaissance, a cultural flowering that in many ways represented the fulfillment of the imperial vision that Timur had articulated through his architectural patronage and forced migration of artists and scholars. The court at Herat under Shah Rukh and his son Ulugh Beg became one of the great centers of Persian literature, Islamic art, astronomical science, and architectural innovation, creating cultural achievements that would influence the entire Islamic world for generations. The survival of the Timurid cultural legacy, even as the political empire disintegrated, revealed an important dimension of Timur's achievement that his detractors often overlook. The forced concentration of talent in Samarkand and other Timurid cities, however brutal the methods employed to achieve it, created centers of excellence that continued to produce remarkable work long after the military power that had created them had dissipated. The Persian literary tradition was enriched through the patronage of Timurid princes. The miniature painting tradition reached new heights of refinement under Timurid patronage, and the astronomical observations conducted at Ulugh-Beg's observatory in Samarkand represented the most advanced scientific work of the 15th century. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Timur's conquests was the establishment of the precedent and the inspiration for the Mughal conquest of India in the 16th century. Babur, the founder of the Mongol Empire, was a direct descendant of Timur through his father and of Genghis Khan through his mother, combining the two great sources of legitimacy in the Central Asian tradition. His invasion of India in 1526, though initially motivated by the loss of his ancestral domains in Transoxiana to the Uzbeks, consciously invoked Timur's example and explicitly presented itself as a continuation of Timurid imperial ambitions. The Mughal Empire that Babur founded, and that his successors expanded into one of the great powers of the early modern world, represented both continuity with and transformation of Timur's legacy. The military techniques, the administrative practices, and the cultural patronage that characterized Mughal rule all drew heavily on Timurid precedents. Yet the Mughals also learned from Timur's failures. Rather than relying primarily on nomadic military power and personal authority, the Mughal emperors developed sophisticated bureaucratic structures capable of governing the vast Indian subcontinent. Rather than ruling through terror and extraction, they created systems of governance that, while certainly extractive and often brutal, also provided stability and prosperity that made their rule more sustainable. The architectural achievements of the Mughal period, culminating in masterpieces like the Taj Mahal, represented the full flowering of the artistic traditions that Timur had fostered in Samarkand. The fusion of Persian, Central Asian, and Indian architectural elements that characterized Mughal buildings traced its lineage directly to the cultural synthesis that Timur had initiated through his forced migration of artists and craftsmen. The Persian literary tradition that flourished at the Mughal court, the miniature painting that reached extraordinary heights of refinement under Mughal patronage, the garden design that transformed the landscapes of Mughal India, all reflected the cultural legacy that Timur had bequeathed to his successors. Yet the Mughal interpretation of Timur's legacy also involved a degree of historical revisionism that obscured some of the darker aspects of his rule. The court histories and genealogies that traced Mughal legitimacy to Timur emphasized his role as a builder of empire and patron of culture, while minimizing or ignoring the systematic violence that had characterized his campaigns. This selective memory served important political purposes for the Mughals, allowing them to claim the prestige of descent from a great conqueror, while distinguishing their own rule from the more brutal aspects of his legacy. The assessment of Tamerlane's place in history has varied dramatically depending on the perspective and values of those making the judgment. For the populations that suffered under his campaigns, he remained a monster of almost incomprehensible cruelty, a figure whose very name invoked terror, and whose legacy was written primarily in mass graves and ruined cities. The estimates of deaths attributable to his campaigns range from 5% to over 5% of the global population at the time, numbers that place him among history's most destructive conquerors in proportional terms. The pyramids of skulls that marked his passage, the cities that never fully recovered from his devastation, the civilizations disrupted or destroyed by his armies, all testified to the human cost of his ambitions. Yet for other observers, particularly those who emphasized cultural achievement and political construction over humanitarian concerns, Timur appeared in a more favorable light. The architectural marvels he commissioned, the cultural synthesis he fostered, and the political unification he achieved across vast territories all represented genuine accomplishments that influenced the development of Islamic civilization for centuries. The Timurid Renaissance that followed his death, the Mughal Empire that claimed him as ancestor, and the artistic traditions that traced their lineage to his patronage all suggested that his legacy extended beyond mere destruction. The paradox at the heart of Timur's historical reputation reflects broader tensions in how we evaluate historical figures whose achievements were built on foundations of violence and exploitation. Can we separate the cultural and political accomplishments from the methods used to achieve them? Should artistic magnificence and political innovation excuse or mitigate the human suffering that made them possible? These questions admit of no easy answers, yet they remain essential for any honest assessment of Timur's place in history. The comparison with other great conquerors of history reveals both similarities and distinctions that help contextualize Timur's achievements and crimes. Like Alexander the Great, he combined military genius with cultural ambitions, yet Alexander's conquests involved far less systematic terror and resulted in more lasting cultural synthesis. Like Genghis Khan, whose legacy Timur explicitly claimed, he built an empire through superior military organization and ruthless determination. Yet Genghis created institutional structures that allowed his empire to survive and even expand after his death. Like Napoleon, he revolutionized warfare while aspiring to create a lasting political order. Yet Napoleon's legal and administrative innovations proved more durable than his territorial conquests. The 20th century witnessed a remarkable rehabilitation of Tamerlane's reputation, particularly in the territories that had once formed the core of his empire. The rise of nationalism in Central Asia, the search for historical legitimacy by newly independent states, and the desire to identify with powerful historical figures all contributed to a renewed interest in Timur that sometimes veered into outright celebration. In Uzbekistan particularly, the post-Soviet period saw Timur transformed from a controversial historical figure into a symbol of national identity and a source of cultural pride. The exhumation of Timur's body in 1941 by Soviet archaeologists revealed a skeleton that confirmed the historical accounts of his physical disabilities, while also providing forensic evidence about his appearance and health. The examination by Mikhail Gerasimov, the renowned Soviet anthropologist, produced a facial reconstruction that gave modern audiences their first scientific glimpse of what the conqueror had actually looked like. The timing of this exhumation, just days before Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, led to legends that opening Timur's tomb had unleashed a curse, though these stories reflected superstition rather than historical reality. The construction of monuments, the renaming of cities and institutions, and the incorporation of Timurid imagery into national symbols all reflected the modern appropriation of Timur's legacy for contemporary political purposes. Yet this nationalist celebration often involved the same selective memory that had characterized earlier interpretations, emphasizing military prowess and cultural achievement while minimizing or ignoring the systematic violence that had characterized his rule. The result was a sanitized version of Timur that served modern nation-building purposes while obscuring the complex and often disturbing reality of his historical impact. The academic reassessment of Timur in recent decades has attempted to move beyond both demonization and celebration toward a more nuanced understanding of his achievements and failures. Scholars have emphasized the need to evaluate him within the context of 14th century norms rather than imposing modern humanitarian standards, while also insisting on honest acknowledgement of the scale and systematic nature of the violence he employed. This approach recognizes that Timur was neither a simple monster nor a misunderstood hero, but rather a complex historical figure whose legacy remains deeply ambiguous. The story of Tamerlane forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, the cost of greatness, and the relationship between cultural achievement and political violence. His life demonstrated that extraordinary military genius and ruthless determination could build empires that spanned continents. Yet it also revealed the limitations of personal authority divorced from institutional permanence. His patronage of art and architecture produced works of enduring magnificence. Yet these achievements were built on foundations of systematic terror and mass violence that corrupted their beauty. The legacy that Timur bequeathed to subsequent generations was profoundly ambiguous, combining genuine cultural achievements with human costs of staggering proportions. The Timurid Renaissance that followed his death enriched Islamic civilization and influenced artistic and intellectual developments throughout the Muslim world. Yet it emerged from the systematic destruction of earlier cultural centers and the forced migration of artists and scholars. The Mughal Empire that claimed him as ancestor created one of the great civilizations of the early modern world. Yet it also perpetuated patterns of conquest and exploitation that traced their lineage to his example. The question of how to remember and evaluate Tamerlane remains contested precisely because it involves fundamental questions about how we assess historical figures whose achievements were inseparable from their crimes. The temptation to either demonize him completely or to excuse his violence through reference to his cultural patronage both represent failures to grapple honestly with the complexity of his legacy. He was not a monster born of pure evil, nor was he a misunderstood patron of civilization whose violence can be excused or minimized. He was a product of his time and place who amplified the possibilities available to ambitious warriors in the 14th century to their maximum extent, achieving extraordinary success through methods that imposed extraordinary suffering. The Iron Conqueror who emerged from modest origins in Transoxiana to terrorize 3 continents, who built architectural marvels while constructing pyramids of skulls, who patronized scholars while destroying cities, remains one of history's most challenging figures precisely because he cannot be easily categorized or dismissed. His legacy compels recognition that human beings are capable of both remarkable achievement and terrible cruelty, often simultaneously and sometimes inextricably intertwined. The monuments he built still stand in Samarkand, their beauty undiminished by the centuries, yet they stand also as monuments to the thousands who died to create them and to the civilizations that were disrupted or destroyed to finance their construction. The cultural traditions he fostered continue to influence Islamic art and Persian literature, yet they emerged from the systematic exploitation of conquered peoples and the forced migration of artists torn from their homes. The political precedents he established shaped the development of subsequent empires, yet they also perpetuated patterns of conquest and violence that would continue to shape Central and South Asian history for centuries. In the end, Tamerlane's life poses questions rather than providing answers about the nature of greatness, the cost of achievement, and the relationship between power and culture. His story forces acknowledgement that history's judgment remains perpetually contested, that legacy is never simple, and that the greatest figures often cast the darkest shadows. The Iron Conqueror who died pursuing one final conquest remains, 6 centuries later, a figure who defies easy moral evaluation while demanding honest historical reckoning with both his achievements and his crimes. The Jade tombstone in the Guri Amir Mausoleum bears an inscription that captures something essential about Timur's character and legacy. "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." The curse attributed to the tomb, whether real or imagined, matters less than the historical reality that Timur's legacy did indeed continue to shape the world long after his death. Through the Timurid Renaissance, through the Mughal Empire, through the cultural traditions that trace their lineage to his patronage, and through the cautionary tale his life provides about the intoxication and the ultimate futility of power pursued as an end in itself. The Iron Conqueror rests beneath his Jade monument, his empire dissolved, his conquests reversed, his political achievements mostly undone by the passage of centuries. Yet the buildings he commissioned still inspire awe. The artistic traditions he fostered continue to influence Islamic culture, and his life remains a subject of fascination and controversy. This perhaps is the final paradox of Tamerlane, that the legacy he most valued, his military conquests and political dominion, proved most ephemeral, while the cultural achievements he pursued as adjuncts to power have proved most enduring. The question of whether this transformation of legacy redeems or merely complicates his historical reputation remains, appropriately, unresolved. Subscribe and welcome to the Empire.